back. Everyone ready? So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dorico Simons, and I'm the Director of Opportunity and Belonging here at NASCAD, and want to welcome you for this evening. I want to give thanks to the communications team, as well to Will for being our tech person for the night. And this event will be recorded and viewable through both NASCAD Facebook page, as well as the ANA Facebook page, and would be able to be shared at request. If there are any tech issues along the way, please comment on the post that you're seeing on Facebook as well throughout the night. If you do have questions during Dr. Nelson's talk, please comment as well on the post with the questions, and they will be fed through for Dr. Nelson to answer. So I'm going to proceed with a land acknowledgement, and we understand that folks tuning in may be tuning in from other parts of Canada, possibly other parts of the world, and we recognize that the land acknowledgement might be different depending on where you are in the world. However, being that this talk is taking place in Halifax or Jabuktuk, we are going to do our traditional land acknowledgement here. NASCAD is in Mi'kma'ki on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So again, thank you for tuning in, and I am going to pass over to NASCAD's interim president, Dr. Sarah McKinnon, for remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorico, and good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah McKinnon, the interim president at NASCAD University. On behalf of everyone in the NASCAD community, welcome to Dr. Charmaine Nelson's lecture, Grappling with the Colonial Archive. I think it's amazing that we have the opportunity right here at NASCAD to develop a better understanding of the real history of slavery in Canada. I'm sure Dr. Nelson has been pretty busy ever since we announced our Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement about 8 months ago. Her success in raising the profile of NASCAD's Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery was clearly evident during African Heritage Month here in February. Dr. Nelson delivered several presentations on temperate slavery in the Canadian context to virtual audiences across the country as part of that month. I think she actually delivered multiple talks last Thursday, including moderating a terrific panel, very dynamic, with graduate students doing research in the field. Through these events, Dr. Nelson is helping people appreciate the Institute as a groundbreaking research initiative. The research will take the forms of scholarly publications and lectures, fiction writing, film and media production, digital humanities and information technologies, as well as in art and visual culture. Dr. Nelson has spent her entire career researching and teaching subjects related to transatlantic slavery and Black diaspora studies through the lens of art and visual culture. And NASCAD is thrilled to have attracted someone of her caliber to be our founding director of our institute. Doing so reflects our aspirations to be a prestigious research institution as well as Canada's premier art university. This research institute will become a place for established and junior scholars, students, artists, museum professionals, teachers, activists, and the public at large to produce and share various types of art, research, and cultural productions about Canadian and transatlantic slavery. Some of you might be wondering why this is important research being done at an art school. At NASCAD, we have a unique opportunity to learn about Canadian slavery through the distinct conventions of the arts and of film. So there's a wonderful fit for us in working in this area. Through stories steeped in visual culture, diverse audiences will experience engaging and relevant content about the nature and representation of slavery in Canada. I'd also like to extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone in our community who quickly and generously helped fund an artist in residence program for the Institute. Knowing that our current realities are a product of a little-known history of colonial exploitation and slavery, we're so pleased that our dedicated and generous donors are helping artists of African descent participate in the work of the Institute. I hope you enjoy the discussion. We're really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our wonderful president, Dr. Sarah McKinnon. And thank you to Sarah as well for her support and leadership of me, for me, and of the Institute and of NASCAD as well. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. McKinnon. I'd also like to just briefly thank some other people who've been extraordinarily supportive of this work, which, as you can imagine, is quite different from the norm for many universities across Canada. So also on my list is Dr. Anne Barbara Graff, our VP Academic and Research, Dr. Martine Juria-Kopp, who is our Dean, Linda McCutcheon, who's Associate VP of University Relations, Kara Holm, Director of Advancement, Bruce DeBay, Communications Manager, Dorico Simons, who you just met, Director of Opportunity and Belonging, Professor Karen Cope, the Chair of Art History and Contemporary Culture, and William Robinson, who is the reason we're able to meet this evening, our wonderful tech support. So just a quick note, I will be using some of the colonial terminology that we find in the archives. And I do that strategically because I believe that in Canada, where this 200-year history has been suppressed, we need a reckoning with this history as ours, as opposed to an import from the United States, which is typically what we tend to tell ourselves. So I'll begin to screen share now, and I'll be back at the end for questions and conversation. The Montreal Gazette issued its first newspaper on the 25th of August, 1785. That the first runaway slave ad appeared the following month on the 29th of September demonstrated the local white settlers' knowledgeable use of print technology to perpetuate the colonial racial order through which their ownership of Black people was justified and secured. Indeed, across the Americas, printers became key allies of slave owners, disseminating ads that sought to entrench their right to hold certain populations in bondage and to criminalize certain populations on the basis of racial identity and supposed inferiority. Transatlantic slavery was unlike any other form of slavery that has existed. While ancient practices of slavery were often based upon xenophobia, class antagonisms, war, or cultural and regional animosity, transatlantic slavery was based upon the idea that biological human differences could be organized and evaluated within a hierarchy, with Europeans the unquestioned ideal. While the indigenous populations of the Americas were sometimes enslaved, Black Africans were the only populations who were always deemed fit for perpetual bondage. Slave owners controlled every aspect of the lives of enslaved people, dictating where and how they lived, where they went, what they wore, when they woke up and slept, what and how much they ate, the duration and type of their labor, and even their reactions and attitudes to their labor. African cultural and spiritual practices and languages were often prohibited or policed. African names were stripped, and social rituals like scarification were banned within one generation of arrival in the Americas. Slave owners even sought to control the intimate and sexual lives of the enslaved, often separating families as punishment or forcing males and females to create new enslaved offspring through systemic coupling referred to as breeding. The extreme sadistic control of the enslaved caused Dr. Orlando Patterson to describe slavery as a form of social death, a life in which the enslaved were strategically cut off from their ancestors and their descendants, and through which social access was dictated and controlled by their slave owners. Under the laws of various empires, to be enslaved was to be chattel or movable personal property, like a chair, a desk, or a bag of salt. A fact highlighted in slave sale and auction notices. Slaves were slaves for life, and furthermore, slavery was strategically organized in a matrilineal order as a means to most fully benefit the slave-owning classes. Any child born to an enslaved female was automatically a slave, taking the status of the mother at birth, regardless of the class, social status, or race of the father. Therefore, the very fabric of slavery served to incentivize rape and sexual coercion, since to impregnate an enslaved female was to enrich her owner with a new unit of labor. Blackness and whiteness, race as we know it today, was a byproduct of slavery and a means through which the enslavement of and expropriation of millions of Africans was justified by several European empires. Together, Britain, Denmark, and Norway, France, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands enslaved an estimated 12.5 million Africans who were systematically and forcibly dispersed. During this forced migration, which sometimes began in Central Africa and regions distant from the place of embarkation onto the slave ship, it is estimated that over 4 million Africans perished. That is, perished before ever getting onto the slave ship. Another 2 million were to die on board the slave ships from illness, the wounds of corporal punishment, murder, and suicide. These captives were mainly shipped from the west coast of Africa to various regions of the Caribbean and North, South, and Central America, including Canada. Although we literally take ourselves off the maps which record slavery, slavery was practiced by the British and the French in the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland from at least the early 17th century. So this doesn't mean that enslaved people weren't taken, for instance, to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, et cetera, but it means they were taken to those regions before they were provinces. Yet Canadian participation in transatlantic slavery is little known both inside and outside of the nation. What replaces it is celebratory narratives of the Underground Railroad and the liberation of African Americans by good white Canadian abolitionists. So this talk is an attempt to disrupt this narrative by remembering the centuries-long presence of people of African descent in the regions which became Canada. More specifically, I wish to offer an overview of the different aspects of slavery and to ask us to consider not merely what slavery was, but the lives and experiences of the enslaved and the unimaginable harm that slavery caused. So there are three types or key types of slave advertisements: sale and auction ads, used for the exchange of the enslaved, and fugitive or runaway slave ads used to hunt and recapture enslaved people who resisted their bondage by running away. As one might guess, sale and auction notices were often characterized by their brevity and dishonesty. This was simply because the motivation to sell one's human property prompted slave owners to lie about the personalities, behaviors, age, and health of the people they held in bondage in order to dispose of them more quickly and, of course, to turn the best profit. As such, slave sale ads routinely proclaimed that enslaved people were honest, obedient, healthy, and physically fit. Runaway or fugitive slave ads were another matter altogether. Enslaved people resisted in a myriad ways, including feigning illness, work slowdowns, secretly practicing their African cultures or maintaining their African naming and spiritual traditions, resisting physical and sexual assault, and for enslaved women, practicing abortion in a world where they were constant targets of sexual violence for profit. However, one of the most common forms of resistance was running away and trying to escape slavery altogether by removing oneself from one's owner. But because the enslaved were so valuable, they were constantly hunted by their owners who benefited from the enslaved person's bondage through the theft of their labor. The notices that owners published in newspapers to recapture the fleeing people were called runaway or fugitive slave ads. Common throughout the transatlantic world, fugitive slave ads demonstrate the ubiquity of African resistance to slavery. Such ads are what Shane White and Graham White have referred to as, quote, the most detailed descriptions of the bodies of enslaved African Americans available, end quote. I would argue that their contention also applies to the regions of the Americas that practice transatlantic slavery in general, particularly places where abolition predated the development of photography. Although published by the slave-owning classes for dubious reasons, because slave owners were so determined to recapture their fleeing property, today such ads have become a key historical source which can assist us in understanding the nature of slavery and the lives and experiences of the enslaved. Slave owners seeking to recapture fugitive slaves employed textual descriptions and standardized images in their ads. However, these textual descriptions were fundamentally visual. Besides noting things like names, languages, and skills, the ads frequently recounted the dress, branding, scarification, mannerisms, physical habits, and even the expressions and gestures of the enslaved. The ads relied upon the primacy of vision as the most effective sensory tool to lead to the identification and recapture of the runaway. Indeed, success was achieved for the slave owner when the mainly white readers became co-conspirators, visualizing, recognizing, and apprehending the enslaved. Ironically, it was the visual individuation of a runaway that became the pathway to recapture and return to their anonymous life as property. The majority of the sources which I draw from are based upon my study of Nova Scotia and Quebec in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Based upon Frank Mackey's compilation of Quebec fugitive slave ads, 45 people of African descent took part in 50 escapes, the last in 1798, and were listed in about 51 notices. Based upon my own archival research, I have thus far located approximately 15 fugitive slave ads for Nova Scotia. The runaway slave ad is a primary source with prescribed limits. The limit of the slave ad is that it confirms only that someone socially deemed to be a slave was thought to have run away from the person who claimed to own the runaway. It is important to note that the archive, however, can never fully recapture or capture the extent of resistance through flight in any given region. Since colonial newspapers were often published only weekly, an enslaved person's quick recapture foreclosed the need of the printing of a fugitive notice. We can then surmise that many, many more people escaped than were ever documented in such notices. Ruling class whites deliberately developed the colonial archive in ways that allowed Africans to enter almost always as the objects or stock, meaning livestock, owned by another, and therefore as partial and incomplete entries. Ledgers like this one created for the Jamaican plantation, Hope Estate, were customarily produced annually on tropical plantations, where planters, as the large-scale farmers were called, often own hundreds of enslaved people on thousands of acres, growing things like sugar, coffee, and cotton. Within this monocrop agricultural system, planters and overseers kept a watchful eye on all of their assets, but especially those most prone to illness, debility, and death, the livestock and human property. Since Canadian slave owners tended to own one or a few enslaved people at once, they often did not require such documents. But others, like estate records, wills, correspondence, and bills of sale, were deemed necessary. These colonial archives of European empires, whether held in Europe or their colonies, are defined by the effacement or the strategic partial representation of the enslaved African. As Anne Stoller has explained, we are left to sort out, quote, what was unwritten because it could go without saying, and everyone knew it. What was unwritten because it could not be articulated, and what was unwritten because it could not be said, end quote. Following Stoller's insights, I would add to our list what was unwritten because to do so would further humanize the enslaved. As such, I want to suggest that the representation of the enslaved by white slave owners and their surrogates was intended as a strategy of erasure. To this end, the colonial archive, of which fugitive slave ads were a significant part, was an attempt at the mastery of an ever-changing world and the conflation of Africans with the status of slave. Research on enslaved populations entails then embarking upon the archival journey with an awareness of the impossibility of full recovery, not necessarily because the documentary evidence has deteriorated or been destroyed, but rather because in many cases it was never created, or because it was created in such a way to make the knowledge of individual human beings impossible to recuperate. We have grown accustomed to using terms like black and white to identify and evaluate one another. But this practice was a byproduct of slavery. Prior to transatlantic slavery, blackness, as we now know and claim to understand it, did not exist. That is because blackness describes the diasporized subject, the person of African descent, whose culture and biology was forcibly transformed through the process of what we call creolization, defined by their contact in the Americas with Europeans and indigenous populations. When thinking about slavery, it is useful then to recall that blackness was a process of becoming, which began as specific African ethnicities or nations. The strategic prohibitions, suppression, and violation of African cultural, spiritual, and social practices, and the forcible mixing of Africans from distinct cultural, regional, linguistic, social, and ethnic backgrounds with other races transformed African-born people and their descendants into Blacks. It is useful then to consider what Blackness really meant in the context of Canadian slavery. In Nova Scotia and Quebec, the terms used in slave ads to describe Blackness were Negro, Negro mulatto, and mulatto. This three-tier hierarchy paled in comparison to the more complex terminology that emerged in tropical plantation contexts like Jamaica. But while such terms were used to describe a person's complexion, racial parentage, or to conflate Blackness with the status of slave, none of them disclosed the origins of those that ended up in Canada. But fugitive slave ads shed light on the complexity of the enslaved population. Within the Quebec fugitive notices, this information can be grouped in 4 categories. 1, those that disclose an African birth on the continent of Africa, that is. 2, those that disclose birth or origin in the USA. 3, those that indicate a Caribbean origin. And finally, those that betray some anomalous characteristic unusual to 18th and 19th century residents of Quebec. So this last category is the most uncertain since it is based upon my educated reading of what is stated and withheld in the notices. In the first category, African birth, whereas fugitive slave ads printed in tropical colonies accustomed to the traffic in enslaved people directly from Africa often stated the fugitive's African ethnicity, Canadian slave owners, far less knowledgeable about such things, tended to identify Africans by accent or tongue, or a non-specific place of birth, or simply the term African-born. In the second category, origin and birth in the regions that became the USA, 6 people listed in Quebec fugitive ads can be potentially identified as African-American Creoles. And the term Creole was used in the transatlantic world to indicate any person of any race or ethnicity born in a colony. So the mulatto, Andrew, who fled from James Crofton of Montreal, was listed as born in Maryland. A Negro named Caesar was purchased by Jean Orlet in 1773 from Garrett Van Vliet in New York. A Negro slave named Ishmael was described by his owner, John Turner, as possessing, quote, a tone of voice peculiar to New England where he was born, end quote. The Negro lad Nemo was described as being born in Albany. And finally, a man named Tite and a woman named Ruth, described as a married couple who were listed in separate fugitive notices published over 5 years apart, which is very, very strange if they're indeed a married couple, had been purchased in Albany, New York. In the third category, Caribbean origin, only one Quebec notice proclaimed this explicitly. The earliest possible Caribbean listed in a fugitive notice was a Negro man named Locanes, who escaped from the merchant and ship captain William Gill in 1775. The enslaved man may have been named after place. Frank Mackey has deduced that the name Locanes may be an Anglicization of a French place name on the island of Saint-Domingue, then a French Caribbean colony and the center of sugar and coffee production. Furthermore, the fact that Locanes purportedly spoke good French, but no English, would align with an experience of enslavement on the French Caribbean island. A fugitive notice placed by Mr. Simon Fraser asked the public to aid him in the recapture of John Thompson, who he described as a Black boy, height about 5'3" or 4 inches, born in Spanish Town, Jamaica. Placed in the early autumn, the September weather was likely still warm enough to embolden the young Thompson, who was accustomed, of course, to a tropical climate. The fourth category is the most nebulous, since again, they are comprised of notices that did not feature specific descriptions of the regional origins of the enslaved. Nevertheless, 5 enslaved fugitives can be assigned to this category: Will, Drummond, Belle, Pascal, and Isaac. In a fugitive notice from 1768, an enslaved man described as a mulatto named Will draws our attention due to his description by the owner, the Quebec merchant Elzier Leve, as speaking English and Spanish. While the first 2 European languages were common amongst the free and enslaved inhabitants of Quebec, Spanish absolutely was not. Since slave owners customarily advise the readers of the language proficiency of the enslaved, as when John McCord explained that the enslaved Negro man Drummond speaks very bad English and next to no French, the absence of a similar clarification of Will's language skills would seem to indicate that he spoke and comprehended all 3 languages well. As such, as a mixed race man, and almost certainly a Creole, Will was most likely born and or raised in a region where Spanish had been spoken, regions which included the southern regions of what was to become the USA, Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean islands of Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And the alternative here is that Will simply was owned by a slave owner who also spoke Spanish and forced him to learn Spanish. Fugitive advertisements often detail the skills of the missing enslaved person, in essence describing the labor that had been extracted from them for free, often under threat of bodily harm by their owners and their surrogates. Jobs like cooper, carpenter, and caulker indicated not just the abundance of skilled labor that whites stole from Blacks, but inadvertently highlighted the exploitation which did not allow Blacks to accumulate the economic benefit of such physical exertions, knowledge, and skills for themselves and their communities. As in other parts of the Americas, men and women, boys and girls were enslaved in Canada. In fact, slavery denied Black children access to childhood, a time of life characterized by a carefree attitude, play, and the constancy of love and protection of one's parents and elders. The normal gender division of labor that applied to the white middle and upper classes did not apply to the enslaved. Peculiarly, slavery both exploded and reinforced certain normative racialized understandings of sex and gender differences in terms of labor. Jamaica was a plantation economy driven primarily by sugar production. As Lucille May Ruthin-Mayer has explained, it was sugar that placed Jamaica at a strategic point in the emerging international capitalist system of the 18th century, establishing it as Britain's most prized transatlantic colony. In 1805, it was the world's largest individual exporter of sugar. Sugar commanded the island's major resources of land, capital, and labor. In 1832, sugar employed 49.5% of the slave workforce, end quote. However, it would be incorrect to assume that such hard labor was reserved for enslaved males. Rather, as Mayer further articulates, quote, the majority of those workers were women, the ratio being 920 males to 1,000 females, end quote. Therefore, the complexity of labor for the enslaved meant that routinely enslaved females performed arduous, monotonous, dangerous work, and that due to their sex, enslaved males were privileged to be instructed in skilled labor, which would allow them to escape field work. At the same time, in tropical plantation slave majority regimes like Jamaica, it was enslaved females who suffered the brunt of the surveillance and sexual violence, which became synonymous with their sexual labor as breeders of generations of new enslaved people. While the insidiousness of strategic sexual violence and breeding is harder to retroactively deduce in slave minority sites like Nova Scotia and Quebec, mainly due to the lack of explicit documentation, Jamaican planters like Matthew Lewis openly kept breeding lists, which monitored and commodified the fertility of the enslaved females in his possession. Therefore, the role of enslaved females as the primary field laborers in Jamaica did not dissuade Jamaican planters from simultaneously extracting sexual labor from them. The dual labor of enslaved females was also normal in slave minority sites. As Ira Berlin and Leslie M. Harris have explained, by their numbers alone, women cooking and cleaning for whites, suckling their infants, raising their children, and succoring their aged were the face of slavery in New York City. Slave women were ubiquitous in the households of New York City's elite and common among the white families of the middling sort, end quote. Both slave sale and fugitive slave notices placed in the Quebec Gazette mentioned the labor and skills of the enslaved people they described. However, since the detailing of an enslaved person's skills was tantamount to advertising their ingenuity, their talent, and intelligence, such descriptions were more frequent in the slave sale ads, in which slave owners were more compelled to present the enslaved person as healthy, trustworthy, and useful property. When an enslaved person fled, owners capitalized upon their wealth, class privilege, and literacy to disseminate their versions of events broadly and to dominate public opinion normally through the vilification of the enslaved, often by portraying them as cunning and idle. In a 1794 Quebec fugitive notice for a Negro man named Isaac Azariah Pritchard, advised the public that, quote, said Negro has been guilty of theft and many misdemeanors, end quote. This imposition of a lopsided truth was also used against white indentured servants or indentured servants in general. When the enslaved Black man, Ireland, and the indentured white Francis Freeland escaped from William Gilliland in Willsboro, New York, Gilliland expounded that Ireland, as he has lived with me without any appearance of discontent for upwards of 13 years, it is supposed that he has been seduced by the little fellow that has gone off with him, and who is well known to many in Canada for his villainy. While some slave owners and employers deployed sweeping generalizations designed to malign the fugitive's character, others provided specific details of the items which had supposedly been stolen. Enslaved female fugitives were not immune from such accusations. When an unnamed Negro girl of about 24 years of age fled from Isaac Worden in Quebec, He included in the notice that she was supposed to have cash, both gold and silver, with her. In Nova Scotia, after stating broadly that the Negro woman slave named Phyllis had robbed the subscriber of sundry articles of value, Abel Michener's fugitive notice proclaimed that she had carried away an assortment of clothing. Although Michener did not use the word stolen, the implication was that her dress could be mobilized to deceive the public. When James Cox advertised in the Nova Scotia Packet and General Advertiser for the return of his indentured blackmail servant, Henry Jones, although he admitted that Jones was in the possession of a considerable quantity of clothing, he interestingly did not otherwise imply that the effects had been stolen. Meanwhile, Abel Michener also took another tactic. While not accusing the enslaved man James of theft or vilifying him publicly, beyond the implication, of course, of the notice itself. And although Michener directed the bulk of his fugitive notice of 1781 to the mainly white reading public, it ends with an appeal directed at James. NB, if the said James will return to his master, he shall be forgiven. Since the same ad did not appear in the May 29, 1781 edition, that is a subsequent week, it is a very real possibility that James took Michener at his word and voluntarily returned to a life of servitude. However, given that a subsequent escape was documented a little more than 5 years later in 5 fugitive notices placed in the same newspaper in August 1786, it would appear that James again grew wary of his life as Abel Michener's slave. Workhouses were a penal institution of choice in which slave owners requested that escaped enslaved people be lodged or locked up in the tropical colony of Jamaica. When slave owners conspired with the public to catch runaways, the workhouse or jail was the usual place that an owner suggested the captured party be lodged. Workhouses also functioned as penal institutions where slave owners could have the enslaved punished and tortured, generally those they deemed to be disobedient, unruly, rebellious, or troublesome. The Reverend Thomas Cooper explained that workhouses were used as punishment for incorrigible slaves who were sent at the whim of the overseer or the master and mistress for any length of time without the intervention of the magistrate. And of course, this was possible because the magistrates in Jamaica, for the most part, were white male slave owners. He also noted that enslaved people were chained together 2 by 2 and forced to repair the roads in the day and locked up at night. Northern British colonies like Nova Scotia also had workhouses which functioned in the same respect. Besides shedding light on the sex and racial makeup of prisoners, the duration of their imprisonment, and the circumstances of their criminal status, the annual ledger of the workhouse or House of Corrections of Halifax for the year 1790 allows for analysis of its role as a site for the criminalization of enslaved fugitives and indentured servants. Although the ledger lists 42 names corresponding to those who were locked up between January 1st and December 31st of 1790. In reality, a total of 35 people, men and women, were incarcerated. And this is because several were locked up multiple times throughout the same year. Of these 35 prisoners, 16 or 17 were women, a fact that can be discerned not because the sex of the prisoner was specified, but because of the gendering of the prisoners' first names. Much like the sex of the prisoners, the race of certain prisoners can also be ascertained, but not because of a specific category in the ledger. The ledger is organized across 2 pages with the following columns: number, names, when committed, by whom committed, when discharged, by whom discharged, number of days in the house, paid for, and remarks. However, racial categorizations were also written into the ledger after the names of certain individuals. Crucially, it is the race of people of African descent only that was highlighted in the ledger in this way through the terms Black and Negro. Therefore, of the 35 prisoners, since the man listed as Joe, numbers 16 and 23, appears to be one and the same, at least 6 Black people seem to have been committed to the Halifax workhouse in 1790. While Hugh Kelly, the keeper of the workhouse, unfortunately did not see fit to include a column for the prisoners' crimes, a remark inscribed in red ink provides a means of ascertaining the most likely crimes of some prisoners. Kelly wrote, quote, "Those marked in red figures have been paid for by their masters," end quote. Unfortunately for my purposes, Kelly also neglected to record the names of the masters who appeared to pay the fines, or their names could be easily matched against the subscribers of fugitive slave notices. Although the word masters does not distinguish between the employer of an indentured servant and the owner of a slave, the addition of racial naming makes it very likely that at least some Black prisoners were indeed fugitive slaves. Of the 42 entries, 9 included the red inked fine, of which 4 were most likely enslaved people whose fines were paid for by their slave owners. Further evidence exists that suggests that Belfast was indeed enslaved. A fugitive slave ad initially dated the 8th of February, 1794, placed by Michael Wallace in the Weekly Chronicle of Halifax, described the escape of, quote, "a Negro manservant, property of the subscriber named Belfast," end quote. The dates of the 2 documents, 1790 for the workhouse ledger and 1794 for the fugitive ads, and the uncommonness of the enslaved man's name, Belfast, make it likely that the man listed in the workhouse ledger in 1790 was also the same man who escaped Wallace in 1794. Although the Black man Joe listed twice was not amongst those who was claimed by a master who paid his releases, the combination of his race, the lack of a family name, and the date of the ledger make it extremely likely that he too was enslaved. That the ledger listed last names for racially unspecified persons who we can assume were white, something that only one of the Black people possessed, that's George Love, is further evidence of the unfree status of the Black prisoners. Of the 51 Quebec fugitive slave notices, 11 were printed for 10 females, 9 enslaved and 1 indentured. In Nova Scotia data, of the approximately 15 fugitive slave ads that I've thus far located, there are 4 fugitive notices for enslaved females. Of these 15 total Canadian notices for female fugitives, several immediately stand out for various reasons. Number 1, for the timing of multiple escapes, and number 2, for the state of the runaway. The mixed race female named Belle is noteworthy for the timing of her 2 escapes, both placed by her owner, the butcher George Hips. The first notice, placed on the 20th of August, 1778, claimed that she had escaped on the 18th. And the second notice, placed on November 5th of the same year, claimed that she had escaped on October 29th. Since most enslaved people in northern colonies deliberately planned escapes in the spring or the summer months to take advantage of the good weather and increased ship travel, Belle's second escape in late October, is particularly significant. Belle's determination to escape Hips is remarkable, not only due to her 2 documented attempts, but to their proximity. The fact that the 2 ads were separated by under 6 weeks is a demonstration of her persistence, as is the fact that the second notice recounted a late October escape when the weather was surely colder. But the notice for her August escape also discloses alarming details. Hips revealed that Belle, who he described as a mulatto negress, had fled with no shoes or stockings on. Whether in August or not, the absence of shoes and clothing for the feet and the legs on an enslaved person in Quebec or Nova Scotia or anywhere in Canada was, unlike a tropical colony like Jamaica, an uncommon occurrence. Thus, that Belle ran away with without proper footwear was surely an indication of her desperation and most likely the hastiness of her first unplanned attempt. For enslaved females, running away was surely often motivated by a desire to escape sexual abuse. The history of Belle's multiple sales to various white men and her identity as a mulatto what most certainly impacted the nature of her enslavement and predisposed her to a certain type of sexual exploitation. Frank Mackey and William Renwick Riddell before him have carefully recounted Belle's multiple owners. It is unknown when Captain Thomas Venture first sold Belle or Isabella to George Hipps at auction. However, in less than 2 weeks after her second escape and subsequent recapture, Hipps again sold Belle, then 15 years old, on the 14th of November, 1778, to Lieutenant Governor Hector Cramier for 50 pounds. Given this development and the fact that his first notice offered a reward of $4 for Belle's return, Hipps' refusal to offer a reward for her return in the second fugitive notice likely indicates his forethought about disposing of her in an attempt to cut his losses and to rid himself of someone he no doubt felt was troublesome. On the 20th of April, 1779, Cramier again sold Belle to Quebec harbor master Captain Peter Napier for 45 pounds. Finally, upon his death on the 9th of February, 1782, Napier's widow, Sarah, sold Belle, identified as a certain mulatto woman known by the name and appellation of Isabella Grant, to Francis Daniel and Richard Dalton, two Quebec merchants, for 52 pounds and 10 pence. 10 shillings, on the February 6, 1783. Therefore, while it is not known how long Hipps held Belle in bondage or the amount of time she was enslaved by Daniel and Dalton, that Belle was owned by Napier and his wife for under 4 years and by Cramier for under 5 months may speak to her ongoing pattern of resistance, a trait which made her an undesirable enslaved person. Secondly, the state of the runaway is poignantly revealed in the 8th of March, 1787 Quebec Gazette ad for the return of a pregnant so-called Negro wench named Bette, about 18 years old, middle stature, speaks English, French, and Dutch languages well. Placed by the Quebec City West Indian trading firm of James Johnson and John Pearce, like the 1791 notice for Chloe, the ad even detailed the time of day that Bette had fled. Bette too escaped at night between 7 and 8 o'clock. Her owner's documentation of the timing of her escape to the hour may indicate that her resistive nature had been previously observed and that Bette, more valuable due to her pregnancy, was under increased surveillance. That the notice was placed the next day as compared to days or even weeks later, like most other Quebec ads, also demonstrates Bette's value as well as the specific nature of her circumstances as a pregnant female enslaved person. As the notice related, Bette was big with child and within a few days of her time. The fact that she chose to flee in her advanced state of pregnancy is surely a sign of some distress with her living conditions, as is a fact of the 12 enslaved female fugitives in both provinces. She was the only one to run away in the winter, the 7th of March, 1787. As an enslaved female, Bette's child, regardless of paternity, would have been born a slave and was to instantly become, like Bette, the property of Johnson and Pearce. Therefore, the urgency of their notice was an indication of the merchants' acknowledgement that they stood to lose not one but two slaves, with the one Bette already proving herself to be particularly valuable due to her fertility. But Bette's escape was unfortunately only temporary. On the 5th of July, 1787, almost 4 months to the day after her escape, a notice in the Quebec Gazette announced the private sale of a stout, healthy, active Negro woman about 18 years old. And you'll see here too that of course they have erased her name, and it's likely of course that they did so strategically because people in the town would have heard of Bette's escape. Like the earlier fugitive ad, Bette's sale notice also duplicates the earlier description of her facility in English, French, and German. As Mackie has noted, the trilingualism that in her fugitive ad was listed as a sign of her cunning and potential vehicle disguise in her slave sale ad was promoted like her other skills as an asset to her owners. It was surely no accident that Bette's name was withheld in the slave ad. Rather, the anonymous notice may be explained by the fact that Johnson and Peirce did not want the sale associated with Bette's previous flight. Alarmingly, too, the sale notice listed only Bette and not her infant for sale. As Mackie has deduced, tragedy had befallen Bette, who in May 1787, quote, having lost her baby, had been briefly held on suspicion of murdering the child, end quote. Bette's maternal loss makes Johnson and Peirce's pronouncement in the slave sale notice that she was very handy in the care of children seem especially cruel and unfeeling. The scale of slavery in Canada, where enslaved minorities were routinely outnumbered by whites, made it no less violent than its tropical counterparts. Indeed, we must consider the extreme toll that multiple transatlantic crossings, isolated living conditions, continual surveillance, hypervisibility, and the accelerated rate of creolization and cultural loss took upon the enslaved. For the enslaved in Canada, we must recognize isolation from self and from community as a form of ongoing trauma and abuse. The Canadian desire to see ourselves as the saviors of African Americans has prevented us from telling the truth about our own slaving histories. Instead, our investment in the retelling of histories of the 31-year period of the Underground Railroad, 1834 to 1865, instead of the 200-year history of slavery, has caused us to erase the profoundly colonial history of our nation, and along with it, the centuries-long presence of people of African descent. Thank you. Okay, so I'll wait for, I think Will or Dorico will send me the questions in the chat. And I'll just say, again, thanks to everybody for attending. And there's no question too basic. Because again, I understand that many of us in Canada have never had the opportunity to study slavery, and that includes me. I've never had a course on Canadian slavery. I had to teach myself about Canadian slavery. And again, what I highlighted in the lecture, I attempted to highlight, is that many of us who grew up in Canada were taught about, of course, the Underground Railroad, and often from the point of grade school. So I'll just wait here for any questions to come in. Okay, so. All right, so I'll just talk a bit more while I wait for questions. So one of the things too, you'll notice that I juxtapose Jamaica with Canada. I'm looking specifically at Nova Scotia and Quebec. And I did that because typically scholars of slavery studies tend to study tropical places or semi-tropical places comparatively, and northern or temperate climate comparatively. So it's rare actually to have someone look at tropical and temperate together. But I did that strategically because it provokes me to shake myself out of this kind of sense that something that happens in one region automatically applies to another. And of course, there's very many things that are different across the climate and regional distinctions of transatlantic slavery. So, okay, so something from Emily on Facebook. Hi, Emily Davidson. Okay, can you speak to some of the factors which contribute to the hidden or forgotten nature of slavery in Canada? Thanks, Emily. Yes, so some of the hidden factors. Okay, so here's the thing. Often when I give lectures on Canadian slavery, the audience will assume that we haven't learned the history in Canada because there's a problem with the archives, that the information is not in the archive, and that's simply not true. So the documents I'm sharing with you are things that I found either other scholars' research like Frank Mackey, William Renner Waddell, Marcel Trudel, etc., or from my own research in the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales de Québec, which is in Montreal and Quebec City, or two of their locations, or in Halifax at NISARM, the Nova Scotia Archives and Records Management. So if you go to any provincial archive and they have usually microfilm reels of the historic newspapers, 18th and 19th century, you will find slave sale ads, slave auction ads, and fugitive slave ads, as well as a wealth of other types of reporting that was coming in and being published in Canada about slavery happening in the British Empire, the French Empire, and elsewhere. So those documents, the printed documents, are there. You will also find the manuscript documents like the ones I shared with you in Canada specifically, where we might not have the big ledgers because we didn't have the plantations. You will find for sure the bills of sale. And I shared a couple of those with you, as well as wills and estate inventories. So the hidden nature, Emily, actually doesn't come from a dearth in the archive. It comes from our lack of willingness to create a curriculum across grade school, high school, college, and university in Canada, and to hire people like myself who have the capacity to teach it. And the situation we're in right now in Canada is there's a handful of us, literally there's probably 4 or 5 of us now, who are employed in Canadian universities. One wonderful scholar of Nova Scotia slavery, Professor Harvey Amani Whitfield, of course, is at University of Vermont. He's not in Canada, but there's a handful of us who routinely teach and research Canadian slavery, who also have access to graduate students. And of course, it's typically the undergrad students are wonderful, they're brilliant, they're amazing. My undergrad students at McGill were extraordinary, and some of them are here tonight, like Roxanne Cornelier. Thanks for coming, Roxanne. But it's typically the master student and the PhD students who will continue in the field. So if you don't have professors who have access to those grad students, then the field doesn't grow. So we have to ask and we have to push colleges and universities to hire people like myself, and we have to push the grade school and the high school to develop the curriculum. So thanks, Emily. Dr. McKinnon, where are the principal archive sources that you have used in your research? Thank you for that, Dr. McKinnon. So again, the newspapers will typically be found in the provincial archives. So if you go to the Ontario Provincial Archive, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, etc., you will also get a lot of them in the National Library and Archives in Ottawa. And you might have them in other different locations as well. For instance, McGill University has a brilliant library, and they own, I think, the Quebec Gazette reels, the Montreal Gazette reels, and I'm saying microfilm reels here because they don't hand you the 18th century newspaper. They hand you a photographed newspaper on reels, okay, because the old paper is too delicate to touch, if they even have that anymore. And they also own at McGill, for instance, the Halifax Gazette. So different university libraries too are equipped with this information. In terms of the manuscripts, typically you have to think how probate functions in Canada, and it's usually through the provincial governments. So the wills and estate records end up in the provincial archives. So here's where this becomes, you can see, I showed you, for instance, I believe the estate inventory of John Rock, who was a Halifax slave owner. So why I went to his estate inventory and will is because an enslaved girl named Thursday, a Black girl, had run away from him in 1772, I believe. Now, for me to find out what happened to Thursday, I had to go to his will. That's one way to try to do this. I look, how many times did the ad run? And when the ad stops, it just tells me he stops printing it. It could be that he caught her. It could be that he gave up. Okay, but I get a duration for the period in which he likely was on the run or had escaped him, eluded him. Then going to his will, though, and this only works if the enslaved person outlives the slave owner. I was able to determine, sadly, that Thursday was captured because she showed up in his will and estate inventory as Black girl Thursday, valued at 25 pounds, and then being sold out of the estate for 20 pounds to John Bishop. So you can see the catastrophic thing here then is to pursue and to find the lives of enslaved people, you always have to search for them through the lives of the people who owned them. My next step to find Thursday would be to try to figure out who John Bishop, her subsequent owner, was. Thank you, Dr. McKinnon. The next question, Maya Bastian. You mentioned that Africans were mainly shipped from the west coast of Africa to various regions of the Caribbean, North, South, Central America, of course, in Canada. Did slave ships come directly to Canada from Africa? Great question, Maya. No, they didn't. So this is the thing. When I show you the ad for Joe, what does that mean? It means we know Joe would have been forced to disembark someplace south of Canada. And then he was forced either through inland travel from someplace like what becomes the USA, or put on another ship and sent to Quebec City. So that's why too, when people want to dismiss, or enslave people in Canada or smaller population, therefore they suffered less. No, absolutely not. We have to think about the multiple crossings then that enslaved people often had to undertake to get to Canada. And of course, they're always forced crossings. That's what we call the Black diaspora, forcible removal. Okay. And in Joe's case, we actually have a letter from William Brown and Thomas Gilmore, who owned him. They're the co-owners of the Quebec Gazette. The founders of the Quebec Gazette were slave owners. They wrote to their mentor, William Dunlop, who was in Philadelphia in 1768, I believe, and said to him, listen, we're having trouble keeping Canadian, meaning French Canadian laborers in the print shop, because we train them and they leave us for higher wages. Of course they do. They're free white people, right? They want a good life for themselves. They're allowed to do that. So they actually write to him and say, listen, we want you to send us a Negro boy who's fit to put to the press. We need to get how bizarre this is. Because Joe becomes literate in 2 European languages. They force him to become literate in 2 European languages. We believe Joe is who they sent. But they say to him, send us a Negro boy from York, meaning New York City, or Philadelphia. And they, in the letter, they give clear indication that they understand the shipping routes and the shipping timetables. So they understand when this Negro boy should arrive in Quebec City. So this letter is fascinating too, in terms of the knowledge of white slaveholders in Canada about other sites and their connections to these other places. But Joe then was African born. And we have to think, depending on his age at the point of embarkation in West Africa, what did Joe remember of Africa? He may have been old enough to have remembered multiple languages, his culture, the parents and elders community from whom he was taken. And what type of suffering is that then for the African-born enslaved person who knows another type of life, who knows and remembers freedom? So we really have to think through that as well. Thank you for that, Maya. Ellis Ng from YouTube. It is fascinating and instructive to hear you discuss your methodological approach and the ways you've used sources like newspapers and ledgers. Are there other types of documents that have been helpful in your search? Thank you so much, Ellis. Thank you for being here, Ellis. Ellis is a colleague of mine from McGill, a wonderful librarian who's helped me many, many times. So thanks, Ellis. Okay, so I shared with you the ads, and that's the focus of one of my next books, so the fugitive ads specifically. But yet the manuscripts too are so helpful. So another thing, of course, is personal correspondence. Now, if we go to a place like Jamaica, Ellis, often you have, especially when you have absentee planters, you have the planter, and that means a planter who stayed back in Europe and had the plantation often in a place like the Caribbean. They're writing constantly to their overseer or the managers or lawyers who are running the plantation in their absence, right? Hence absentee planter. So in many cases, in some cases, you have rare finds where you have hundreds or in the tens of letters that have still been preserved, that still exist, that detail those conversations going back and forth across the Atlantic. And they can be really detailed. Things like, what are you feeding the enslaved people? What is the mortality rates? Often they're discussing the fertility. So are the enslaved people reproducing themselves, which was called natural increase? So those are absolutely there. We have correspondence too in Canada, but it differs in that we're often dealing with slave owners who you might have a lot of their correspondence, but a few mentions of the enslaved, because the daily in and out lives of the enslaved and labor of the enslaved didn't preoccupy them the same way as a planter who owned hundreds or thousands of enslaved people at once. So you might be looking for one paragraph about the enslaved person that someone owned in a stack of, let's say, 50 letters in Canada. So that's really painstaking work. The other thing too is business ledgers. Okay, so I talked about the workshop ledgers, the workhouse ledgers for Halifax, 1790. But William Brown and Thomas Gilmore left really detailed ledgers about the Quebec Gazette that mentioned Joe and another enslaved person, I believe, named Saney. So they owned at least 2 enslaved Black men. So we can uncover quite a bit about them, even in terms of purchases made for them and their treatment, et cetera, through the notations made. And they also give monetary sums for how much things cost for those 2 enslaved men. So one interesting case is that in the business ledgers, they mentioned that they sent for a doctor to treat Joe for smallpox, which is intriguing. Why? The letter I mentioned from 1768, when they wrote to William Dunlop in Philadelphia saying, send us a Negro boy, and we think that's Joe. They specify in the letter, we want a Creole, meaning we want someone born in the Americas. Why? Because they want someone who they perceive as not resistant. Joe's the opposite of that. We know that Joe fled. Joe's documented in, let's say, 6 fugitive slave ads for 5 escapes across 9 years, I believe. And we know that Joe escaped probably 3-4 other times, but there's no ads for that. But we know that from jail records. So they got exactly the opposite of, they got the opposite of what they wanted with Joe. But also they asked in the letter for someone who had already survived the smallpox. Why? Because the next epidemic, you're inoculated, you're not going to die. Or so they assumed at the time, right? So it's very interesting then to see in the ledger a notation that they sent for the doctor to treat Joe for smallpox. So that would indicate that Joe likely had never had it before he was sent north to Quebec City. So thanks so much for that, Ellis. Tamara Kelly Beckett from Facebook. Okay, so no problem. I apologize. I missed part of the talk. Can you tell me when slavery started in Atlantic Canada? And I have to say, I didn't know about a lot of this. The only reason I knew a bit was because I found an article about a slave near Fredericton, New Brunswick. I wanted to thank you for your talk. It was very interesting and eye-opening. Thank you so much, Tamara, for being here. Okay, so when did it start? Okay, so scholars who focus on Nova Scotia slavery have argued that they believe when Cornwallis comes with the initial group of white settlers with the British colonization of Nova Scotia, that there were likely enslaved people among that group. And then very shortly after, of course, we have the Revolutionary War take place. And at that point, we get both an influx of free Blacks, right? So the Blacks who were fleeing to the British lines and who were promised their freedom to be loyal to the British, right? To flee from their American slave owners, because we have the Revolutionary War going on. And we also have the enslaved African Americans who are being forced north with their white slave owners. So it's a very complex mix. And then on top of that, Tamara, the ad I showed you from Joshua Major, who was bringing in and trying to sell a group of Creole enslaved people. That ship is coming, we know, from the British Caribbean, because of course, different empires usually traded amongst their own colonies, right? So since Nova Scotia was British, the ships that are allowed in were British, okay? Unless they were clandestine, right? They're secret. So that ship too, indicating Creole, the term Creole was used in Nova Scotia to mean Caribbean born. So we have a group of Caribbean born enslaved people being sold in Halifax. So why I say that is there have been a constant influx of small numbers of enslaved people from the Caribbean on merchant ships that had a primary cargo of the plantation produced crops, like the rum, sugar, molasses, coffee. Okay, then 5 enslaved people, 10 enslaved people, 15 enslaved people also on those ships. So we really haven't done a lot of research on what that means, who those people were, and where they ended up, of course. But many of them would have been born in the Caribbean, but others may have been like Joe, African born. They drop you off in a place like Jamaica, you get thrown back on another ship, and you get sent to a place like Halifax. So also African-born people would have been amongst that group. So, and I would like to suggest that that ad by Major suggests that, because 2 of the boys, I believe 12 or 13 years old, it says they speak very poor English. That's not possible for the most part if they had been enslaved their whole lives in Jamaica. They would have been forced to learn English if they were Creoles from Jamaica, if you get me. So that for me is a flag that says they may have been African-born people who were only spent a short time in a place like Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and then were put on a ship very quickly and sent north to Halifax. Thanks very much, Tamara. Victoria Lessard. Victoria was, I have to say, a former MA of mine at McGill. Brilliant person, brilliant student. And Victoria is the reason I can show you all these ads, because Victoria was my research assistant who did all of this wonderful hard work of digitizing these ads. So thank you so much, Victoria, for being here. In your research, have you noticed any differences in the fugitive notices in Canada versus the Caribbean or American notices? Yes, Victoria. So one of the most basic things is that you'll notice in the Canadian ads, there's a very, what I think for the rest of the world is a very bizarre icon that looks like a stereotyped Indigenous person in a grass skirt and a grass hat. You don't necessarily see that. I haven't seen that in the American context or in other contexts. I think that is uniquely Canadian. And I think that has to do with the fact that in a province like Quebec, where we're seeing that icon, most of the enslaved people, the majority, 2/3, were Indigenous. They're known as Pawnee. Pawnee was the name given to an enslaved person of Indigenous ancestry of any background. So Panis, Pinse, if you were a female. So the icons are different, Victoria, but also what is different, if you notice the one I showed from Jamaica, and it says there's a Congo escaping with a Creole of Spanish Town, I believe. So in Canada, all the ads I've seen, they're talking about African-born people like Joe. They'll say African-born or born in Africa or Guinea accent, something like that. They'll refer to the way they speak, or they'll refer to the fact they're born on the continent. They don't say any specific ethnicity. Whereas in a place like Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, the slave owners there knew African ethnicities because the slave ships arrived directly from Africa, and it behooved them to know. And they actually developed theories on the nature of enslaved resistance on the basis of the ethnicity of the Africans. So in a place like Jamaica, what you see is that slave owners were terrified of Coromantee slaves, right? Coromantee was an ethnicity that that was from Africa. So you saw the management of plantations to organized around not having too many Coromantee on any given plantation because of the fear that they were more resistant than other ethnicities or nations, if you will. Okay, so that, Victoria, we have not begun to understand what, how much, and if slave owners in Canada understood African ethnicity specifically. I think someone like William Brown, who owned the Quebec Gazette and owned Joe and Saney, would have understood something, even though when he's printing the ads, he says Joe African born or born in Africa. And why do I say this? We know about his history that before he came up with the idea to found the Quebec Gazette with Thomas Gilmore, he was sent by his mentor, William Dunlop, to Barbados to try to found a newspaper in Barbados. What would he have seen in Barbados? Plantation slavery 101, with slave ships arriving directly from Africa. And he would have then been exposed to African-born enslaved people. So I'm trying to figure out, does he not say that in his ads? Does he not say Joe Congo in his ads because he knows that other white slave owners don't know what he's talking about? Or does he not spend enough time in Barbados to know and develop an understanding? Right? But again, we need more information to figure that out. So thank you so much, Victoria. Kelly Lawton, all these friends here. Thank you for being here, Kelly. So do you know anything about the ship of Maroons that were sent to Jamaica, from Jamaica to Canada? Thanks, Kelly. So I haven't studied the Maroons too much specifically. Of course, this complicates the context of slavery in Nova Scotia. You can see Nova Scotia is completely atypical in Canada and a lot of other regions, because again, you have the Cornwallis moment, you have the Revolutionary War moment, you have the War of 1812 moment, you have the ships coming in for the Caribbean with enslaved people, Creole and African born on the ships. And then you have the Jamaican Maroons who show up, I believe, in 1796 or the 1790s and stay for about, I believe, 4 years and then agitate. And many of them end up going to Sierra Leone. So, you know, one of the things that I kind of daydream about is what would it have been like for an enslaved person in Halifax or in Falmouth in Nova Scotia to encounter a free Jamaican Maroon, right? So, and because by all kind of reports and records and histories, Jamaican Maroons were intensely, fiercely proud of the fact that they were self-liberated, they were militaristic, and they were not taking it. So they were promised when they got to Nova Scotia that they would be treated as free people. They were free people. They were not given the proper rations, food, shelter. They were not treated with respect, and they were able to petition and agitate so much that, you know, they were able to leave. So what were those encounters too between and across different Black populations? And I'll just say there too, it's really difficult to research free Blacks. It's actually harder in a way to research free Black people and populations in the period of slavery than it is to research the enslaved, because the enslaved you can track through the owners and the owner's documentation of the slave. But the free Blacks, if they were poor, which many were, of course, because just because you're not an enslaved person doesn't mean you're not suffering from racism. So unless you were wealthy enough, you're not going to leave behind deeds for land. You wouldn't have been able to purchase significant livestock. So for instance, in Nova Scotia, 1790s, you have a poll tax. But who shows up in the poll tax for us today as scholars go back and learn about those people? Mainly white free men. Why? Because you were only taxed if you owned a certain amount, or if you owned land, or a certain type of livestock, like a cow or a horse. If you had a chicken, they weren't going to tax you. So in my encounters with the study of the poll tax, I found only about 30 Black men and no Black women, very few white women, right? So here's the thing, how do we even begin to research free Blacks as well, is a question. Thank you so much, Kelly. Andrew Hunter, hi Andrew. So another friend, can you speak a bit about Canada's economic foundation in transatlantic slavery, the business relationships that were embedded in the slave economy, thinking of people like McGill and his business empire and Cunard shipping, right? Oh my gosh. Well, this is the thing, right? We have to think that when we think about a lot of the typically men in the 18th century and how they made their wealth, we've done a lot of revisionist history on them in terms of what we inherited about how they made their money. So up until up until my students and I undertook the bicentennial report of McGill University, the university had on its website, McGill University, that James McGill, I think, was a fur trader, period, and a great philanthropist. And it's only after my brilliant students wrote the 97-page report for the bicentenary of the university that they updated that biography to say, by the way, he was also a slave owner and a West Indian merchant. So just like Peirce and Johnson, who owned Bet, James McGill was in shipping and was bringing in rum and sugar, I believe, and molasses into Montreal. And here's the thing, he would have made a considerable amount on the rum, because we're dealing with Montreal in the 18th and 19th century was what? A garrison town, my friends. There were thousands of British soldiers there. And what we don't understand today is that British soldiers were given a ration of rum a day as part of their food rations. And Montreal, if you go back and study 18th and 19th century Montreal, it was full of taverns and what was called grog shops. And an interesting fact, grog was actually watered down rum. So the term groggy today that we take and we use it to mean someone's sleepy, it actually meant drunk or tipsy, right? To be groggy was to have imbibed drunk grog, which was watered down rum. So there's a lot of grog shops and a lot of taverns there. So who was supplying them with the rum? People like James McGill. So we can't underestimate how much his West Indian trading is what enriched him to become this great philanthropist. We also have to think critically about who his philanthropy benefited. Who did he donate to, which organizations, in a period where often organizations like hospitals were segregated and didn't treat people of color or Indigenous people. So we have to think through that as well. So thank you so much for Andrew, but very, very profound connections between money produced on the backs, and can I just say, produced on the backs of enslaved people in Canada, and for someone like James McGill, the exploitation of enslaved people in other regions too, is what we have to understand. Okay, Robin Metcalf, another wonderful friend. Okay, so Robin, thank you for your fascinating ongoing research in the search in the 70s, seeking information about queer experience in colonial Nova Scotia. I had to rely on newspaper and court records of criminal prosecutions. Okay. Similarly, you are recuperating information about specific enslaved people from records of their conflict with those empowered by the colonial legal and property apparatus. Can you say more about how the reliance on records kept by those in charge of the apparatus of repression shapes our understanding of the people subjected to the repression? Thank you, Robin. What a brilliant question. Okay, so there's a lot of scholars of slavery studies that are at the forefront of critiquing the archive, right? And you can see that I call the archive colonial, and I question what it is, and that it's absolutely not this objective container of facts. But I'm thinking of someone like Marissa Fuentes, of course, and Gunvor Simonson, who writes about the Danish West Indies. They've done profound work, and that connects exactly with your question, Robin. So what I'm thinking through here is, for instance, Gunvor in Professor Simonson writing on the Danish West Indies. When she's looking at legal documents and court transcripts. Now get this. So enslaved people in Danish West Indies, of course, like other parts of the transatlantic world, not considered human, considered objects. They could not be plaintiffs in a case. They couldn't say, go to court and say, I'm coming to court to charge my slave owner with whipping me and abusing me. No, not going to happen. You're not a human. You cannot bring a case. So where did they show up in court? As witnesses being forced to testify either against other enslaved people or sometimes against whites. But what she highlights, Simonson, is that various forms of torture were commonplace, like the use of whipping or thumb screws. So what I find that is really intriguing too, is just another dimension of this, and this gets complicated, the Danish West Indies was not populated in a majority sense by Danish slave owners. There were white slave owners of all different backgrounds, including British people who lived in the Danish West Indies and owned enslaved people. So what happened there is that the language spoken by the enslaved people was typically English once they lost their African languages or could no longer remember them. But the language of the archive was Danish. So you had translators who were scribes who were taking down what the enslaved witnesses were saying, but translating it into Danish. So there's like so much room to mess up there in terms of, first, it's not the same language. And second, it's always through a white lens that we even get supposedly what the enslaved African person was saying. But I thought a remarkable incident that Gunvor uncovered of enslaved resistance in the archive was there's a case of an enslaved man accused of helping an enslaved woman to flee, and 3 other enslaved people from his plantation were brought in to testify against him, and of course they would have been tortured. So what the court wanted was for the 3 other enslaved people to say, yes, we saw him help her. And instead, even under torture, the 3 of them insisted that he was at a party the night the enslaved woman escaped and that he could not possibly have helped her. So I'm thinking we have to understand how remarkable this is, because maybe he helped her, maybe he didn't. We'll never know. But even under torture, the 4 of them did not change their stories. So I think this is where we get the expression reading against the grain. And we always have to take the archive with a grain of salt, because it's almost impossible when we do this research to get information from the enslaved. A person like Frederick Douglass, born into slavery in Maryland, self-liberated, goes on to write 3 autobiographies. There's one Frederick Douglass, my friends. That's it. That's him. Okay. That is completely not normal. Okay. And even for the Caribbean, for instance, we only ever have discovered one fugitive slave narrative by an enslaved woman. That's Mary Prince. So we typically do not get words from the mouths, the pens, the thoughts of the enslaved. So we're left to sort through in this critical way, of course, what the slave owners and their surrogates have left us, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Robin. Beth, Wukash, let's see here. Were there Black people who were enslaved by the indigenous people? Yes, there were, for sure. People have talked about that. Peter Beth in the context of, I believe, the Cherokee in the USA. That's been studied quite a bit. Also, I think my friend Andrew Hunter, who's on here, has recently published a book. And Andrew, if you type it in, I can tell people about your book on, I think, Sophia Pooley, who was owned, I think, by Joseph Brant, who's a very famous Canadian Indigenous person, okay? So yes, absolutely, that is also true. But we have to, you know, and I mean, Andrew could speak more to this, but we have to figure out if they were holding within indigenous concepts of indigenous slavery or within chattel slavery, because they're two different things, okay? So indigenous people had practices of slavery which were not chattel slavery. So for instance, it didn't attach to you necessarily for your whole life. It couldn't be passed down to your children, et cetera, et cetera. So there are people studying that though too, Peter. So hopefully you'll be able to look into some of that some more. Sorry, I'm not an expert on that. Bruno Veras. Bruno, thank you for being here. Hello, Professor Charmaine. I have a question about how much the sources from Nova Scotia and Atlantic provinces would allow us to think about specific African ethnicities. Yeah, Bruno, I'm stuck on that too. I don't think they're helping us a lot in what I found so far. What I find in the ads is African-born, Guinea accent, born in Africa. Like, yeah, they're not telling us ethnicities. And it was really painful for me too, because I really want to know, where is Joe from? What was Joe's specific experience of his ethnicity? Would Joe have been able, for instance, to speak to another African in a place like Quebec in his native languages? Did he have any opportunity to preserve his African ethnic specific identity? And so until we, I think maybe we're going to have to find some incredible correspondence from a slave owner who bothered to pay attention to something like that, because the ads are not seeming to be very fruitful on that note. Thank you for that, Bruno. That's something I'm thinking about too. So just a couple more, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for your interest, everybody. Andrew McLaren, thanks so much for sharing your valuable research. One question I'd like to ask is, what inroads are available in researching the history of slavery in French colonial Canada, given that there was no active press in New France during those years? You said it, Andrew. Yeah, that's what I found too. All the scholars are saying there was no press there. So I think what we're going to have to do in New France, that's Quebec pre-1760 for everybody, right, is to find correspondence of the slave owners. And of course, the correspondence would be fruitful here, because listen, if there was no press, don't think the slave owners weren't sharing information when someone ran away. How would they have been sharing the information? Through correspondence. And they're doing that in the British period when the name change happens, 1760, and it's Quebec. We have some correspondence from British slave owners post 1760 where they're writing to their friends saying, my enslaved person so-and-so just ran away, look out for them, help me catch them. So of course that would have been happening in New France because there was no press. But exactly how, what were the mechanisms? We know though, the military and the jail keeper and the workhouse keepers would have been tasked with that as being a part of their job, their responsibility. And I say that too because under the British, some of the fugitive ads I'm encountering were actually placed by the sheriff, not by the slave owner, okay? And that's when you have a jailbreak of a fugitive, the sheriff is placing the ad. Thank you for that, Andrew. And just let me see here. Last question, Tamara Kelly Beckett. Thanks again. This talk made me want to learn more, and I believe this should be taught in schools. Thank you so much, Tamara, for saying that. And I'll just say to everybody, one of the things we want to do at the Institute is to support curriculum development. I know there's so many brilliant educators and teachers at grade school level and high school level who want to teach this material, and you cannot teach what you have never learned. So that's not their fault. They want to know, they want to teach. So we want to support you in that. So as soon as possible, we're going to try to develop some curriculum and have seminars or workshops at the Institute to be able to enable curriculum to be rolled out in different parts of Canada. So thank you for saying that. That's the thing. We can't just rely on this being something taught in universities or colleges. You know, to really grasp this material, we're talking again about a 2-century history. It's really something that we can be and should be sharing from a young age. And I'm talking grade school. There's appropriate ways to teach this to grade school children and to high school children. And, you know, I just point to the children's literature that exists for other regions. There's a lot of books on slavery for grade school children and high school children about American slavery, particularly the American South, and about slavery in places like the Caribbean. It doesn't exist for us because we haven't done the work. So we really need to, for the government and different universities, to start to hire people like myself and explicitly say, we want to hire a scholar who can teach Canadian slavery across various disciplines: history, anthropology, art history, biology. There's amazing scientists working in this field on things like nutrition, on different diseases that were in abundance, let's say, during the Middle Passage on slave ships. So there's room across disciplines for this work, but we need the universities to step up and actually do job searches to hire people like me. And so there'll be more people able to train the next generation of brilliant scholars going forward to do this work. And I'll just say again, the information is in the archives. That's not the problem. It's boots on the ground. It's people doing the work, looking at that information in the archive, who have the capacity to interpret it and move forward with that. So thank you all again so much for attending. I'm just overwhelmed by your graciousness, by your investment in this work. Thank you so much. And please keep us in mind. We'll be trying to do events all the time, conferences eventually. And one last note, we're hoping that by 2021, 2022, starting in the fall, we'll be able to welcome 2 artists in residence, excuse me, and 2 different grad student fellows. That will be our first cohort of 4 fellows at the Institute. So we're off and running. Thank you so much to all of you for your support and for spending the time with us tonight. I know you could be doing other things. Thank you. Have a wonderful night. Take care.